When one thinks about Disneyland Paris, there are many things that may come to mind. Ideas such as fun, attractions, vacations, or even Mickey Mouse himself. What doesn't come to mind often is that the huge European resort was on the brink of bankruptcy just months after its opening. There are many reasons as to why the EuroDisney resort failed during the early years, and we will go over what went wrong right now.
Boy!
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Main Street News. If you're new, make sure to join our community by subscribing, following us on Twitter, and joining our Discord. Links are in the description. We also have a Patreon if you want to support what we do even more. At the time, in 1985, the Walt Disney Company already had 3 theme park resorts around the world. The original Disneyland in California, Walt Disney World in Orlando, and Tokyo Disneyland, which had just opened its doors. This last resort was an instant success, and one of the main reasons lies in the culture of the country. After World War II, Japan was occupied by the US from 1945 to 1952, during a time of military, political, economic, and social reforms. As this happened, one of the first pieces of media that the Japanese were allowed to watch was classic Disney shorts, featuring Mickey, Minnie, and their friends. Because of this, the people became very fond of these characters and were longing for the American company to build a Disneyland in Japan. This finally happened in 1983 when a deal was struck between Disney and the Japanese Oriental Land Company, which paid for and operated Tokyo Disneyland. To this day, OLC owns and operates Tokyo Disneyland in what just might be Disney's best partnership ever, as the resort now has 2 highly acclaimed theme parks, many hotels, and several great future projects. With that resort being a huge success, and with a lot of newly found confidence, the then new CEO of the Walt Disney Company, Michael Eisner, started to shift his eyes from Japan to a new continent, where a lot of the fairy tale stories that inspired Walt Disney came from, and that was Europe. The first thing that has to be done is to choose a location, but that is no easy task. The place has to be easily accessible, close to dense population areas, big enough to expand for years to come, and, on top of that, cheap to purchase. There were more than 300 proposed locations for the Euro Disneyland Resort, but the final 4 were down to 2 countries, France and Spain. At the end, the French government made an amazing offer, which included a sale of the land for a very cheap price and the promise of many infrastructure projects, including the extension of the RER and a new TGV line. The Salomon Brothers spokesperson said that it was the deal of the century, and so it was signed by the 2 parties, and Disneyland would find a new home at the heart of Europe, just a metro ride away from the City of Lights, Paris. Marne-la-Vallée was nothing but farms and farmhouses. So how do you transform endless and boring fields into the Wild West, lands of fantasy and discovery, and most importantly, a resort? With the help of Imagineers, of course. These people design parks, shows, attractions, music, hotels, and anything else needed for a Disney resort. And from the start, they wanted to blend American culture with French culture to create a new and unique product that would cater to the finer taste of the European market. One of the most notable changes in the layout of the park was the exclusion of Tomorrowland, which had been transformed into a new land called Discoveryland, a place where you can step in the future imagined by the great visionaries of the past, such as Jules Verne, Leonardo da Vinci, H.G. Wells, and George Lucas? Well, I guess they needed some Star Wars in the park. Unfortunately, not everything was smooth sailing, as just after construction began, the French Communist Party started to make their voices heard by protesting against the company, many times screaming, "Mickey, go home." The French and Americans have a very strange relationship. Sometimes they like them, sometimes they hate them, and this was no exception. Let's not forget that during this time the Cold War between the US and Russia was still very much happening, and bringing Disneyland to Europe could be seen as an attempt to Americanize Europeans. The French were not fond of this idea. Here in France we have this history of culture. Everything is very intellectual, and then comes Disney, it's a little mouse. And when you compare it, you ask, is that culture? Said Philippe Gas, ex-president of EuroDisney. Even with all this trouble, plans were still going forward, but the controversies were only starting. When the recruitment began, many guidelines had to be strictly followed, which included minimal facial hair, no tattoos, some hairstyles, and others. This and many other decisions were supposedly the only way to completely provide the Disney experience. The problem though, no one remembered to ask the French if they wanted it in the first place. On April 12, 1992, the resort opened, and with it came a huge theme park filled with different themes, attractions, and details, a shopping area, 6 hotels, a campground, and a golf course. It wasn't long before problems started to happen, and they did so in that first day, as protesters tried to cut the power lines and blocked the roads leading to EuroDisney. That day, it was expected that more than 300,000 visitors could show up. The real number, though, a much more modest 25,000. Things weren't looking good for EuroDisney during that day, and honestly, many more days after. And Michael Eisner was even quoted for saying that there was nothing off the table, and that closing the resort was a possibility. The worst part of this whole thing is that the park was amazing. Imagineers went all out and it showed. This was by far the most beautiful Disney park anywhere. The rides were the most advanced and detailed, the lands had all sorts of incredible storylines and theming, and so did hotels and everything around it. Funnily enough, it wasn't the park that caused its downfall. It was actually doing pretty well by itself. The main problem was everything else. There are many reasons as to why the resort didn't stick the landing. Some more important than others. One of these was, as I said, everything around the park. Guests didn't see the resort as a multi-day destination, and this made it so that the hotels had so many empty rooms. It even came to a point where some of the hotels were closed down because of the lack of visitors. Guest spending was also much lower than anticipated, so they weren't making as much money for merchandise and food as they had hoped. The global early 90s recession obviously didn't help, but the problems were much deeper than that. The resort was a failure, while the park was a success. But a theme park isn't unchangeable. If something doesn't work, it can be fixed. And so they started to fix the problems, or at least tried. As I previously mentioned, cultural differences didn't help their case, so this was one of the first things to change. An example was the fact that there was no wine sold inside the parks. In France, it's normal to have wine during meals, or at least have that availability. So when visitors enter the park and see that this isn't the case, their first reaction is they don't understand this, or worse, they don't care. Because of this, in the coming years, several adjustments were made to better cater the target audience, including lowering prices and selling wine in the restaurants. Even the name EuroDisney had to change, as while Americans might associate Euro with Europe, romance, and love, most Europeans associate it with currency, so the name was dropped and changed to Disneyland Paris, marking a rebirth of the resort. It wasn't until 2 years later that the resort turned a profit, in 1995, and that was mostly due to a new attraction that perfectly appealed to the public, Space Mountain, this time based on the Jules Verne story De la Terre à la Lune. I made a video about this ride and how it saved EuroDisney some months ago, so make sure to watch that as well. The public's opinion started to change, and the French became more sympathetic with the company as headlines changed from cultural Chernobyl to a much nicer EuroDisney reports its first profits. While the resort was given a lifeline with Space Mountain, the problems didn't stop there, and for many years it still struggled with the financial side. In 2016, the Walt Disney Company announced that they would buy back the resort from investors, and since then we've seen an amazing refurbishment of everything, from hotels to the parks and attractions. And lately, the story has finally changed, as Disneyland Paris has been hitting record profits and revenue quarter after quarter. To this day, the failure of EuroDisney is used as an example of what not to do when entering a new culture. Disney also took this experience and learned from it, which is very clear in Shanghai Disneyland, the resort that opened in 2016, as from the beginning, that project was authentically Disney, distinctly Chinese, and that turned out to be a success. Unfortunately, because of the massive failure that was EuroDisney, we will never get to see the completion of the incredible plans that ranged from a massive water park, huge new themed hotels, a major second park filled with theming and incredible rides, and even a third park. You know what? With all this thinking about what could have been, I want to learn more. What if EuroDisney hadn't failed? Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in this week's video. I'm really looking forward to that next video as I got my hands on some incredible plans and concepts. If you enjoyed, make sure to like and subscribe. And now, as always, thank you for watching, and that's a wrap.